Pitchers Garrett Whitlock and Tanner Houck had a lot of expectations on them going into the 2022 season. In some ways, they met those expectations. In other ways, they didn't. But in this episode, I'm going to be reviewing their performances in the 2022 season.
You are Locked On Red Sox, your daily Boston Red Sox podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I want to welcome you back into Locked On Red Sox podcast, and thank you so much for making Locked On Red Sox your first listen of every single day. I'm your host, Massachusetts Pirates team insider, Jake Ignaszewski, and in this episode, we're going to be reviewing the performances of pitchers Garrett Whitlock and Tanner Houck. But before we begin, I wanted to mention I hope that you did enjoy Lauren and I's conversation with Red Sox pitching prospect Thad Ward. And if you haven't checked that out, make sure to go and check that out as well. It was a great conversation learning about his journey coming back from Tommy John surgery, as well as what he's working on in the Arizona Fall League. But now getting into these player reviews, and this is something that Lauren and I sort of wanted to start doing to look back at some of the performances from the 2022 Red Sox roster. And these two pitchers really stood out to me, Tanner Houck and Garrett Whitlock. As I mentioned in the open, both of these guys had very high expectations on them going into this season, specifically Garrett Whitlock. Whitlock was coming off of a season where he sort of took not only the Red Sox nation, but the major leagues by storm. Ended up coming from the Yankees in the Rule 5 draft and also coming back from Tommy John surgery going into the 2021 season, and ultimately ended up being the most reliable arm for the Red Sox throughout the 2021 season. Ended up accumulating an ERA of 195 over 46 games. And there was a lot of expectations for Whitlock to come off of that season even better. But the big question was, how were the Red Sox really going to use him? Whitlock came up through the Yankees farm system as a starting pitcher and was mainly labeled as a starting pitching prospect. But we saw him flourish so much throughout the 2021 season in that bullpen role, and especially with how unreliable we saw the Red Sox bullpen throughout this season. It really seemed like that throughout the year, they should have just kept him in that bullpen role. And even to this day, there's a lot of fans who like to debate whether the Red Sox should stick with Whitlock in the starting rotation or if they should just keep him as a bullpen arm. Because you see in the past, and Lauren and I have brought up this subject multiple times on this podcast, sort of the Daniel Bard effect. We saw when Bobby Valentine decided to take Daniel Bard from a bullpen arm, which was what he was used to throughout his career in the majors thus far, up to the point where he got moved as a starting pitcher in 2012. And we really saw that it really impacted not only his production, but his ability to throw strikes. Ended up getting the yips. And also that led to him being sort of taken out of baseball due to his inability to throw strikes. And now, luckily, he found his way back to the majors. The yips are behind him, and now he's flourishing with the Rockies. But that's something where it still gives me PTSD. And, I don't want that same thing to happen to Garrett Whitlock or Tanner Houck. And we saw Whitlock start the season in the bullpen role and then ultimately was moved to the rotation, but not on purpose. Tanner Houck was ultimately in the starting rotation to start the season for the Red Sox, but since he couldn't travel to Toronto due to vaccine protocols, the Red Sox decided to move Garrett Whitlock to the starting rotation, and it worked out for the most part for his first few starts. And then we saw him really start to struggle. You saw batters really start to understand how to attack Garrett Whitlock and really start to understand where his pitching locations were going to be, and really took advantage of Whitlock, especially with his inexperience as a starting pitcher. It really showed in the stats. As a starter, Whitlock ended up starting 9 games and accumulating an ERA of 4.15 over 39 innings with 38 strikeouts and 9 walks. And interestingly enough, he ended up practically pitching the same amount of innings as a reliever during the 2022 campaign, although it was 39.1 innings. But as a reliever, his statistics were much, much better, having an ERA of 2.75 over 22 games with 6 saves, and as I mentioned, over 39.1 innings. But the main thing that the Red Sox really need to figure out is how are they going to use Garrett Whitlock during 2023. Now, he recently signed a 4-year deal at the beginning of the season that has him signed up until the end of the 2026 season and ultimately becoming a free agent in 2027. And he did end the year around the beginning of September. He ended up undergoing season-ending hip surgery, and his hip was a problem for him throughout this year. We saw on June 8th, he got injured with that same hip and didn't come back until July 15th. And from this time period, that's sort of when the Red Sox figured out that they needed to move him from the starting rotation to a relief role to really limit the workload that they were putting on Whitlock. And you really also heard as well from different reporters, as well as Jared Carrabis, who was speaking with the team at the end of the season, that Whitlock wasn't walking like himself. He was walking with a limp. And you also really saw it on the field as well. He just didn't look like himself at the end of the season. And that hip definitely must have been nagging him as he continued to add up that workload as the season went on. But really looking at the difference between 2021 and 2022, I tried to look into the numbers a little bit. And one thing that really stood out to me was his BABIP, which is his batting average on balls in play. In 2021, it was 0.095. In 2022, it was 271. And so batters were hitting the ball exceptionally better off of Whitlock in 2022. So the balls in play that essentially were getting caught or were recording as outs during 2021 ultimately ended up being recorded as hits much, much more often for Whitlock during 2022. And so that's the big question is, are the Red Sox going to use Garrett Whitlock as a starter or as a reliever in 2023? And if it was up to me, I'd say start him out as a reliever, see how he really acclimates to that hip injury. Don't put so much work on him to where he has to go through another hip surgery or continue to nag on that injured hip, and really get him back and comfortable, because that's the main thing that the Red Sox really need to figure out is once they figure out that exact role that they want to have Garrett Whitlock play for them, they just need to keep him there. They can't keep going back and forth. And, I'm going to say the very same thing for Tanner Houck as well in our second segment. But Chaim Bloom ended up giving a little bit of insight, not too much, but at the end of the year, got asked by Boston Globe's Peter Abraham on what he thinks Garrett Whitlock's role is going to be in 2023. He said, "I'm not ready to break that news on that front. I think we're fortunate in him to have someone that wherever you put him, he's going to be able to impact the club. I will say that I think that just because of the situation our bullpen was in and the situation that he was in physically, I think there's perception he didn't succeed as a starter. But when you really peel back the layers and look at what he did, it was pretty impressive, especially having to move into the rotation on the fly. So in my mind, that makes me think that we will probably see at some point in 2023 Garrett Whitlock in the rotation. Now, that's just me making an assumption just from how Chaim Bloom phrased that quote, but I wouldn't be surprised. Now, Whitlock did have incredible stuff out of the bullpen. It's what made him so effective. And it was really nice because he was sort of like a long reliever throughout 2021 and 2022 as a reliever, and was able to come in, pitch 2 to 3 innings, get the Sox out of the jam. But we really saw him at the end of the year, once we saw his hip really start to nag him a lot, that he was a lot more ineffective and ended up allowing a lot more runs than we usually see him do. But that's one thing as a starter compared to a reliever, which made him so effective, is that he struggled allowing balls in play. His stuff was not as dominant as a starter as it was as a reliever. And I think, sort of as I mentioned before, I believe that batters really got used to how Whitlock was attacking them. They got used to his pitches. And he just needs to find a better way to be able to attack hitters multiple times. And that's something that, especially if you haven't started even in the majors yet, that's tough to get used to, is being able to get around that order the third time around. And that's something that we saw with a guy that we're going to be talking about in our second segment, in Tanner Houck. He really struggled with being able to get around that third time in the order, not only when he was a starter in 2021, but also in 2022. But the big question, and I'm really curious to hear your guys' thoughts, is should Garrett Whitlock be a starter or a reliever? Let us know over on Twitter at LO_Red Sox. But overall, I think, to end this review for Garrett Whitlock, he gave the Red Sox exactly what they asked for. As a starter, he did his best to acclimate to being a major league starter and did relatively effective, even though it wasn't what most fans expected, especially with how dominant he was not only last year, but as a reliever this past season. He still was able to be a middle of the road average starter in the majors. And then ultimately, when they moved him back to that reliever role, he did exactly what the Red Sox asked him to do. He was able to get them out of different jams. He was able to be effective as we saw him in 2021. So I'm so excited to see how he recovers from his hip surgery and how he's going to continue to get better and better, because now that the Sox have him locked up for the next 4 years, all he can do is just continue to develop, continue to fine tool his talent, and continue to develop and be able to produce in big roles for the Red Sox. But going into our second segment, we're going to do a review on Tanner Houck. But before we do that, I just want to take a second to talk about betonline.net, which is your number one source for betting football and the start of the new basketball season. Find all the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth analysis on every game. And as always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all your sports wagering information with live betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every sport out there. It's the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite games and events, including MMA, MLB, boxing, and golf. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. And we greatly appreciate everybody making Locked On Red Sox their first listen of every single day. Now make your second listen Locked On Sports Today. From the games that matter the most to the biggest stories in sports, go beyond the scoreboard and behind the scenes with local experts and insights only Locked On can provide. Locked On Sports Today, available on this app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. Now looking into Tanner Houck's 2022 season, there was some ups and downs. As I mentioned, as a starter, he struggled, but he didn't really have a lot of time to really show what he could do as a starter, despite we saw him struggling a little bit last year when he was able to get consistent starts for Boston. But going into the season, it was announced by Alex Cora after spring training that Tanner Houck was going to be placed in the starting rotation, and a lot of fans were really excited, even myself. I named him one of the potential breakout candidates going into the season, and I believe he still deserved that title. Maybe not as a starter, but as a reliever. We saw him be very effective as a reliever, especially in the closer role. Overall, as a reliever, he pitched 43.1 innings with 43 strikeouts and ended up accumulating an ERA of 2.70 with 8 starts. And especially in save situations, he had 10 games to really show what he had in the closer role and ended up amassing an ERA of 0.79. And he was really, to be quite honest, the only pitcher in that closer position that really was effective every single time he went out there. And a lot of fans were getting really excited that Tanner Houck could be the future closer of the Red Sox. But he ultimately ended up getting back surgery and getting injured midway through the end of the season. And he should be back for spring training. But I'm very curious to see if the Red Sox do continue to use Tanner Houck in a reliever role or in that closer role. Now, we saw the closer situation be very weird for the Red Sox throughout the season. I'm somebody who, there's a lot of rants out there from this past season on the Red Sox closer role. You can sort of look back, but it seemed like anytime the Red Sox needed to close down a game, they didn't have somebody in their bullpen that they could just turn to. There was guys like John Schreiber that you could go put in there to really close it down. Garrett Whitlock as well, but you can't overuse those guys to the point where they're going to be really ineffective, especially in the most important inning of the ninth. And Tanner Houck really came up to the plate and was able to do exactly what the Red Sox asked him to do. But he was only put in that reliever position, as I mentioned before with Whitlock, because he couldn't travel to Toronto due to the vaccine protocols. And so that actually took him out of the rotation and then put Garrett Whitlock in. But over his 4 starts in the rotation for the Red Sox, he accumulated a 4.32 ERA over 16.2 innings and 13 strikeouts. He did struggle like he did last season, getting around that third time in the order. And that's one of the biggest reasons why I believe he is best to be used as a mid to short reliever, especially when he's recovering from back surgery. And I think with that back surgery, that just tells you perfectly that you should not use him in the starting rotation, because especially if he felt like he was being a little bit overused and put a lot of strain on his back, then you don't want him going out there for 5 to 6 innings. And even when Houck was a starter over his time with Boston up in the majors, he was only able to go 4 to 5 innings. And especially with what the Red Sox are trying to do with the rotation next year, hoping that it's a lot more reliable, and hoping as well that they're able to get starters to go a lot deeper into games, so maybe they don't have to use so much of their bullpen like they did this last season. That's something that they're going to have to keep in mind when figuring out how they want to use Tanner Houck. But despite not only what he was able to do in the reliever role, but also as the closer, I think that Tanner Houck had an incredible season, was really able to show what he could do for the Red Sox in the future, especially coming back from this back surgery. I'm so excited to see sort of how he's not only used, but where he's used, because in my mind, I can honestly see Matt Barnes going into that 8th inning role, John Schreiber in the 7th inning role. But where do you put Tanner Houck? Maybe in the 6th inning, or if the Red Sox don't figure out the closer situation, put him in there. But at the same time, if they're looking to contend next season, they want to get a solidified and proven closer, especially in a position that is so important as a closer. When you're going in the most important inning of the ninth, maybe they were intrigued from Tanner Houck's performance out there, but I feel like, especially when he's coming back from surgery, you want to ease him back in and not just shove him right in to that closer role with tons of pressure and tons of expectations. But I think Red Sox fans should be very satisfied and happy and excited with not only Tanner Houck's performance in 2022, but also with Garrett Whitlock's. And that's one of the biggest reasons why I want to sort of pair these two players together in this review, is because they're semi in very similar situations. They don't have an exact role in the Red Sox future plans. Now, they could either be starters or they could be relievers, and both of them are coming back from season-ending injuries. So it's really all going to come down to how the Red Sox want to utilize them next season with whatever moves they make during this offseason, and where they really see their recovery going into spring training. I think it's really best for them to just ease both of those players back in, especially with both of them still being very, very young. And that's the nice thing as well, is that there's so much potential for both of these players, and especially with the Red Sox struggling with the depth that they've had in not only their rotation, but in their bullpen over the past few years, and especially with what we saw last season. The Red Sox are going to need both of these guys more than ever in 2023 to help them get back to contention and get back to a playoff contending team. And that is all really going to come up to Chaim Bloom and his decisions on how he wants to utilize these guys. But I want to hear your guys' thoughts on what you thought of Tanner Houck and Garrett Whitlock's seasons. Let us know over on Twitter at LO_Red Sox. Also, let us know where you think the Red Sox should use Tanner Houck in 2023. But you can also follow myself over on Twitter. It's at Jake Iggy, and also Lauren is la 3 laws, Lauren with 4 R's. But we're going to keep bringing you great Red Sox content Monday through Friday, not only with these player reviews, different interviews, sort of like the one we did in last episode with Thaddeus. But we want to keep bringing you as much great Red Sox content throughout this offseason. Doesn't matter if the Sox aren't playing, we're going to keep on posting. But as always, we greatly appreciate everybody making Locked On Red Sox their first listen of every single day. Now make your second listen and check out Locked On Sports Today. From the games that matter the most to the biggest stories in sports, go beyond the scoreboard and behind the scenes with local experts and insights only Locked On can provide. Locked On Sports Today. It's available on this app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. We greatly appreciate everybody tuning in. We hope everybody has a great rest of their day, and we'll end this how we always end it. Let's go Sox.